is Saturday, November 7th. And we went out to Sedalia, Missouri this morning to look at the historic district off of Ohio Street. And check out a lot of the main buildings there. They date anywhere from like the 1870s through the mid-century, 1960s, 1970s. So we're just I shot some footage of that and we toured around, so I'm gonna talk a little bit about the history of Sedalia and these buildings. If you draw a line between Kansas City and Jefferson City, in the middle of that line will be Sedalia, although it's a little bit closer to Jeff City.
Well, maybe it was a winch to let it curtain or something.
Sedalia at one point rivaled Jefferson City for the title of capital of Missouri, but it was unsuccessful. Instead, now it hosts the Missouri State Fair.
Probably buy Rob another camp stove.
So Sedalia is known for many things throughout history here. Today we're just going to focus on what is remaining of the original buildings along Ohio Street and some of the buildings along Main Street. Some of the most notorious areas in the original Downtown Sedalia. These streets do appear on some of the oldest maps of this town from the 1860s, and they are still here today, and they have experienced a lot of growth and decline over the last 150, 160 years. You can see by looking at these buildings that a great deal of time and care and effort was put into their design. They definitely had architects that spent a lot of time designing these, and people who were craftsmen who definitely spent a lot of care in crafting these and building them. The brickwork is stunning, and it's amazing to see them here today. However, it's really sad to see how much some of these buildings are in extreme disrepair, and once you lose these buildings, they don't come back. What you see are remnants from the past, and they really need to be preserved, or else they just will not exist into the future. Some of these bricks are beginning to crumble and fall off. There's cracks. They need tuck pointing. They really need someone to come in and preserve these buildings and preserve the history of this town. Obviously, by taking a peek in here, you can see the extent of the damage. You can see that pigeons have just made a mess of this place, and that it suffered a lot of water damage and just general rot, and the ceiling is falling in. The internal structure looks a little bit unstable, although the bricks still look relatively stable, it looks like. But there's a lot of decay going on here. Desperate need of rehab. Someone who cares for this building needs to come in. There is a empty lot behind this building, and that is where another building similar to this had been already lost. In a way, looking at this is like seeing a miniature representation of what the entire city of St. Louis, Missouri is going through. That city is pretty much all brick buildings, and they've lost so many of them. It's just, if you don't preserve historic buildings, they go away forever. Makes me sad. Anyway, the buildings along Main Street, being some of the oldest buildings in town here, are a representation of how life was after the Civil War ended. These buildings would have serviced what what needs came in on the train line. It would have been warehouses, parts, it would have been anything to service the needs of the people, utilizing the train line for cattle, storage, probably, goods and wares. What we are looking at here are some of the oldest buildings that still remain in Sedalia along Main Street, down by the railroad track line. These buildings essentially became the most seedy red light district in the entire city as time went on, and a lot of them ended up being brothels. The reason for this was because after the Civil War, the railroad boomed back to life, and Sedalia became a huge point of cattle drive terminus, essentially. Lots of cattle drives took place going through Sedalia. It brought in a lot of cowboys or transient type of people, and also people that worked on the railroad. And they were obviously temporarily placed in this town, and it was a place where lots of people could come in via easy transportation, via the railroad in the early years. And they were just rough and tumble cowboy town. It was definitely a Wild West type of environment in that time period. The website legendsofamerica.com has some really interesting information. It's one of my favorite websites. They do have a page on Sedalia, and they talk a lot about the history, and they specifically mention that about 1868, that's when the city started spending a lot of money on brick businesses. Building those brick buildings, they spent about $286,000 at the time to start establishing these brick businesses down by the tracks. Frame buildings started to become a thing of the past at that point. Manufacturers moved in, including Kelk's Carriage Works, Barley Brothers and Company Agricultural Machinery, and the Barrett Brothers Novelty Works, which furnished sashes, doors, blinds, and moldings to many early businesses. Civil improvements were also made, including the paving of Ohio Avenue, and the gasworks were constructed to provide lighting to the city. At the time, the population had grown to about 6,000. The Katy Railroad arrived in the 1870s, as we know that it extended across Missouri at that time. Again, it became a very seedy area with all the transient type of railroad workers and cowboys and travelers making their way across the state with cattle drives and so forth. It became a center of vice, especially prostitution. The brothels, as we talked about, were very common. They were commonly distributed throughout the city alongside gambling halls and saloons. These establishments also employed musicians, primarily and particularly piano players, contributing to a thriving music culture. It fostered the development of many artists, including the renowned ragtime composer Scott Joplin. So, Sedalia is the home of the Ragtime Music Festival every year, and it is said to be the birthplace of ragtime. So, Scott Joplin did write the maple leaf rag here in this town, so that is an extremely interesting fact. If you ever visit Sedalia, you can think about the ragtime history here as you look at these buildings. So we just walked by the police headquarters in Sedalia there. On this street here, we just saw the Carnegie Library. It's a very gorgeous, beautiful, stunning building. Andrew Carnegie awarded Sedalia a $50,000 grant to construct a new library. It's located at 311 West 3rd Street. It was dedicated in 1901. It replaced a smaller library that was located in the basement of the Pettis County Courthouse. By the turn of the century, Sedalia had a population of a little over 15,000 people, 4 newspapers, 4 banks. There are still some lovely historic stone and brick churches here located in Sedalia that you can see when you drive through the town. They're very incredible, very beautiful pieces of architecture. And right before that, we got a little glimpse of Coca-Cola Bottling Works building in the 1880s and on. Sedalia was a popular place for bottling works. Soda and the beer industries were major businesses. So obviously when Prohibition occurred, it affected some of the breweries in town. Bootlegging was a major problem, and obviously that combined with the prostitution center of vice, it went hand in hand. You could get your liquor while you're taking care of your other vices down in seedy district. Anyway, from Legends of America, it states that in 1886, the Salvation Army established a post in Sedalia, and the Army's founder, William Booth, traveled from London to attend the event. When Captain George Parks was asked by the Sedalia Democrat why William Booth had purposed to locate his Salvation Army in Sedalia, Parks responded, quote, "Because Sedalia is a desperately wicked city, and if souls can be won for Christ in Sedalia, they can be won for Christ anywhere," unquote. Parks was sadly later beaten very severely in downtown Sedalia. He had to travel home to Chicago, where he was from, and then he died from that beating nearly a year later. He was so wounded. He was considered a martyr, the first martyr for the Salvation Army in the United States. It's kind of a sad twist of events in this town. The Legends of America page goes on to talk about some of the more difficult events that Sedalia faced in the late 1800s. There was the financial panic of 1873, which affected the town greatly. A smallpox epidemic that occurred the same year. The courthouse was burned down by arson at that time as well. They had a plague of grasshoppers, and a lot of other fires that destroyed a lot of buildings too. And around that period, of course, as we know, vice was vigorously consuming the town. The gambling and brothels were out of control in the town, especially between the 1870s all the way up to the mid-1900s. In fact, it was still a known problem in the town up until the 1970s, and it was notorious as a wide open town with gamblers, pimps, prostitutes, and other types of mafia people and other rough and tumble criminal people. It was condemned by polite society. The problem was all of these criminal activities that were going on were also patronized by the men in control of the legal system of the police and the courts, so that was a big problem. The church as well, the press, they're all part of the economic structure of Sedalia that contributed to the criminal components of this town, unfortunately. And the prostitution provided a certain degree of economic security for women with no other options for employment, and it enriched the city, ironically, through the repeated fines and bribes that they had to pay. So it paid for programs in the city. 217 West Main Street was a notorious brothel. We just peeked in the door of that and saw the staircase a little bit ago. It was a two-story Italianate-style brick building. Initially held a clothing store on the first floor, and the upstairs rooms were a brothel. It was a problem well into the 20th century. It's so interesting to be able to come here today and see the remnants of that history, and realize that actually happened here. It's just crazy, because today it's actually a relatively quiet town. Here again we have some wonderful little architectural details from the old iron facades, old cast iron facades. Most of them were imported from St. Louis, and obviously they came in by train. I love to walk through these old towns and look for those little details, those architectural archaeology details. When you come to Sedalia today and you go to Ohio Street, there's a sign across the road that says something to the effect of like Main Street America or Downtown Sedalia, and it basically, when you come here, there are coffee shops, thrift stores, home decor shops, dress shops, comic book shops, all kinds of little mom and pop stores that still operate here, and they do need your business to stay alive. There's a lot of restoration efforts that have been taking place in recent years here, but when people do come along and try to restore buildings, a lot of them sometimes are not aware of being sensitive to how you actually perform historic preservation restorations. So that definitely is something to keep in mind. Please do historic preservation research before you alter your historic building, I would recommend. The U.S. Department of the Interior has some wonderful resources on how to restore historic buildings. One of them is a book called The Preservation of Historic Architecture, so I would recommend that, and also any other resources you can find on accurate and proper restoration techniques and methods for these buildings. Certain historic building materials, as they've aged, have certain needs to preserve them. I would recommend you be aware of abatement needs in your building before you mess with it. It might contain asbestos, lead, or other toxic materials or chemicals. So it may need to be abated by a special company who is licensed to do that. Other needs, the most important thing you can do for a building is waterproofing. Focus on the foundation and the roof. You want to make sure that your basement is not leaking, that you have a secure foundation, that it's not collapsing your building, that it's fortified appropriately, that the building has proper support, that there's not big cracks in the walls or the stone foundation oftentimes, or brick or concrete or whatever your foundation is made out of. You need to be aware of the care there. And as far as your roof goes, you need to make sure that it's not leaking. That will destroy a building faster than anything if water's coming in. When it comes to brick buildings, you need to be aware of tuck pointing needs and making sure that your brick is stable. You want to make sure that moisture is not being trapped in the cavity walls, and that you have appropriate mechanisms in place to dehydrate the air, dry it out, whatever, get the moisture out appropriately, because moisture being trapped in a building is not good either. You want to make sure that you don't have wood rot, and that your wood joists, timbers that are in place, especially if they're load bearing, can properly support. You might need to replace some of those or fortify some of those with some injections or other means and methods. I suggest that you research that appropriately or contact people who are knowledgeable on the topic to advise you. Other things about your building, check in about your glass. Make sure that you have a properly sealed building envelope for energy efficiency purposes. You want to make sure you're not wasting heat or wasting cold air, etc. Sun angles, you want to make sure the sun's not fading stuff inside your building. You might want to replace the glass with low E glass. Here in Missouri, we have really hot summers and really freezing cold winters, so we recommend double pane glass, low E glass, which is it doesn't let as much of the sun's radiation in. What else? There's a lot to buildings. They're just such fantastic things. Paint colors, historic paint colors. There are paint companies that offer palettes that are sensible when it comes to matching historic colors. Sherwin-Williams, for instance, does have an entire historic color palette that you can check out. It matches certain colors to certain decades. The population in Sedalia kind of stayed around 20,000 people. It did actually go up a little bit in the 60s to about almost 24,000 people. Not too significant though. And they did have some revival in their downtown businesses, and as shopping centers came into town and opened. The automobile obviously changed everything, as it did in many of these small Midwestern towns in the 1900s. It definitely shifted the town center from the train tracks and train stations at one side of town to south of the town, in this case, where the highway was grown and developed. The automobile definitely led to the expansion and development along the highways through this town and in the state in general and in the country. Another view of the Pettis County Courthouse in the middle of town there. Nice looking place. So right across the street from that to the northeast, you've got this little building here called the Equitable Building. I can't find too many records on this building. However, I can tell right off the bat that it has an Art Nouveau influence in its design. You can tell by the way some of the curved lettering is bulbous in some areas and thinner in others. If you do a search for Art Nouveau, you can definitely see what that style looks like, and you can see the influence that it's had on this building. That was popular in the 1890s, and I would say that this building looks like it was probably designed around that time, but it looks like it was built maybe in the early 1900s. So it's a beautiful brick building here. I'm gonna go up and take a peek inside. I hope nobody minds. I want to look at the architecture of this building more closely because it is in such a beautiful original state here. It looks like it's been occupied by some local businesses here pertaining to the bail bond industry and the jail that it sits right next to here. Obviously in the league with the Pettis County Courthouse, Pettis County Jail, or Sheriff's Operations or something like that. But anyway, so this building here, it still has some, you can tell it uses radiant heating, and it's got radiators under the windows, and it looks like it's got, this was sort of a classic style of buildings from the 1890s or early 1900s, that they had these stairways, these steep type stairways that went up to the main entry. You had one that was just slightly off of street level in this case, and then you have another stair that descends directly from sidewalk street level down to the lower portion of the building where you would have had maybe another business. And then you've got a third entry along the front of this building, which opens up straight to a staircase that goes straight up to the second floor. So you would have multiple entry options here for multiple businesses to take place in this building. On the side of this building on the north, there is also another entry in the back that goes up a stairway there as well. So it in this day and age, it's a disaster, because for ADA purposes, this is a complete disaster. No one who has a disability that requires a wheelchair or crutches or anything like that would have an easy time accessing businesses in this building. So that is however, since this building is historic and it's just such a beautiful building here, you could probably get away with that. It's grandfathered in. It would be good if there was an alternate entry to have ADA access, however. So anyway, this building is quite a challenge when it comes to today's building codes. Quite honestly, I can't imagine what it would be like to have to live or work in this building, especially in winter time when you've got ice and snow on the ground, trying to make your way up the stairs or down the stairs to get into your office. It would be quite the challenge. So now is the moment you've been waiting for if you know anything about buildings in downtown Sedalia. I've been walking back and forth in front of the Trust Building as well as the Bothwell Hotel. Those are the two most prominent buildings in the entire area here in downtown Sedalia. So here we are now, finally I'm walking inside of the Bothwell Hotel and I'm going to get some interior shots. They're all decorated for Christmas, even though I'm shooting this here in November, which is just fine with me. This is just clearly an amazing building. I'm going to talk more about it. So as you can see here, we've got the latest courthouse in the middle of town, Pettis County Courthouse, the Bothwell Hotel. It was built in 1927. It was touted as the first fireproof hotel in town. It was the tallest building at the time. It was opened by John H. Bothwell. They needed a modern fireproof hotel in the downtown to serve the increasing number of business travelers and tourists coming in at the time. Again, this was right before the stock market crash of 1929, so this was just a couple of years before that. It was a 7-story classical revival style hotel built at just over $400,000. It was a major center in Sedalia for many, many years, and it is on the National Register. Many famous people have stayed here. According to Legends of America's website, again, President Harry Truman, actress Bette Davis, Clint Eastwood, many more stayed at this hotel. It's located at 103 East 4th Street, and you can stay here today. Sedalia was hit really hard by the stock market crash in fall of 1929, and the Depression hit big time. Many of the banks closed in town, and people couldn't get their money. There were many of these bankers here in town. 3 leading bankers committed suicide in rapid succession at that time. So it's very unfortunate as well. A lot of people were laid off, especially the railroad. Things didn't really kick back into gear until the war, World War II, happened. This says that Sedalia was the town second hardest hit by the Depression after Gary, Indiana, in the country. So that was a major blow to the city going into the 1900s. The population was never really the same. It decreased after that. There wasn't as many jobs in town. So again, the war kind of helped though. The way Ohio Street is laid out is to the north. It intersects with Main Street, which Main Street is parallel with the railroad track, which is still there, still operating. And Ohio Street basically runs north and south. It's got a curve in it, which makes for elegant pictures of buildings. When you're facing down the street, you can see this really nice line of buildings, and it curves into itself, sort of. But anyway, or it angles into itself. And at the south end of Ohio Street, it intersects with Broadway, which is basically 50 highway. It leads out to Warrensburg to the west. And anyway, so all along this street, and streets adjacent to it as well, parallel to Ohio Street, this is where you'll find all of these wonderful historic buildings. So today, remaining here, you can still see some of the oldest buildings, again, which stem. They're oldest at the north end of Ohio Street. They stem from the 1870s, as we talked about, late 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. All along this street, you can still see buildings from the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, early 1900s, all the way into the Art Deco phase. You can see a lot of Art Deco influence, which started to come into play in the teens and 1920s, and also 30s and 40s. Right now we're checking out the old theater that's here in town, peeking in. They've been attempting to restore this theater for several years now.
We've been working on
so
this
it's
for
still
years.
a work in progress. Again, it looks like, I don't know if this theater, how old it is exactly, but it looks fairly old. It looks like it's from the 19 teens, and it probably would have hosted vaudeville. And it also has some Art Deco influence in its design here as well. Oftentimes, what happened with the old vaudeville theaters is if they stayed a theater, they were converted, into to show like silent movies and ultimately talkies, or movies where they could have sound instead of just a live musician playing. So I just looked up this theater. It's called the Uptown Theater. This website is ksisradio.com, and this building was actually built in 1936. So it's located on South Ohio Avenue in historic downtown Sedalia. The space served the community for decades. It reads as a vaudeville theater and a movie theater, which also hosted live music throughout the years. This also hosted country musicians, Tex Ritter and Tex Owens. The space has been closed for the past over 40 years now at this point, though. So there is a local effort to renovate the theater. They're making some decisions about how it will be used in the future. It's being gutted out so that the wiring and boiler can be replaced and all that sort of thing. The mechanical, electrical, and the plumbing can all be rehabbed and brought into the current day. They'll also be redoing the seating and the stage. They said that historical murals and artifacts from this theater have been saved for a following phase of the construction later on. It's lacking funding, obviously, right now. It needs tuck pointing. I guess it's a brick building too. You can't see it from the front, but it is a brick building. That tuck pointing is necessary to replace the mortar between the bricks and make it a sound and solid structure. We talked about this a little bit earlier, building care and maintenance and renovating buildings and rehabbing them. Very important piece of brick buildings. They hope to have 700 people able to have seating for that many people in this building as soon as it's finished in the future.
Yeah, that's us.
It's owned and operated by a nonprofit group called the Sedalia Downtown Development, Inc. This is a music store, and they have a great mural of Scott Joplin on the side of it. We are walking north again, back towards Main Street. As we're heading north, we have passed some other shops where you can see the facades. They have incredible Art Deco designs on front of them. There was that bridal and dress shop that we passed a little bit ago. There's also some old bank facades along here, and sometimes down these alleyways you can see bay windows. Those are like Victorian design components that allowed for people to even get light and air in the alleyway situation, where there's a lot of shade and it's kind of dark and cold. At least they could still get some fresh air there. And so there was one building back there that had a bunch of like bay windows in an apartment situation on the second floor, throughout one of those alleyways that abuts on the next door building. Anyway, a little bit more about Scott Joplin, basically just from Wikipedia. He was born about 1868 in Texas, and he died at age 48 in New York City, New York. However, he spent a good part of his life in Sedalia, Missouri here. He moved to Sedalia in 1894, and he earned his living as a piano teacher. He did write the Maple Leaf Rag about 1899, which made him famous. And it influenced a lot of people, and it kind of established the bar for ragtime. He obviously, if you're a piano player in Sedalia in the 1890s, you're going to be earning your living in the red light district in brothels or bars or gambling halls. So there's a lot of vice involved there. He probably contracted syphilis in Sedalia, frankly, which killed him. Sorry to say, but true. In 1901, he moved to St. Louis, where he continued his pianist musical career. He always had it rough. He didn't pay his bills. He got married and divorced or something like that, and lost his child, and his belongings were confiscated because he didn't pay his bills. He kept trying to get a better life, and it just wasn't working out. Then he started to get sick. He moved to New York in 1907. He made a lot of recordings and things. He was extremely talented piano player, obviously, but he was ill-fated. Obviously, his disease was beginning to ravage him, and he just couldn't play anymore, and he finally passed away. But anyway, Sedalia played a major role in his earlier career. So now we're getting ready to leave, and as we drive out, this is such a neat drive to head up and down Ohio Street. It's such a quaint type of town, and it's almost like a Fisher-Price setting or a Sesame Street setting in a way, like a good character backdrop for like a production or something like that. Just because of all the colors and the shapes and styles and designs that you pass and see along the way. I was going to note that bank that I walked by a little bit ago, both in the beginning of my videos and the end of my videos there. It's one of those buildings that looks like it's from the 1880s, and it's just been adapted over time, and I believe it's still a bank, and it had that old burglar alarm mounted on the face of it, which is really neat. It's crazy to see those things on buildings sometimes. I've seen that in some other places I've been. It's common. It looks like they've tried to adapt this bank. They had that garden drive-through feature where a teller could sit in that little piece that comes out where it can accommodate a car to come through a drive-through, and that looked like it was instituted in the 50s or 60s. So they tried to adapt it to the needs of their clients over time. That's amazing little piece of history right there. But anyway, there you have it. I mean, there you have this nice view of like Main Street America and in Sedalia here, and in life in the late 1800s and all throughout the 1900s. Gives you a good glimpse of 19th, 20th century. So I hope that you enjoyed this. I certainly did. I love architecture and history. So this is just a great place where those elements combine.